Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today we have author Michael Gawenda joining us for our book talk, My Life as a Jew, and he will be in discussion with Andrew Silow-Carroll. And just to let everyone know, this book recently won the Kaplan Family Jewish Book of the Year Award in Australia, so another reason to pick it up. And for those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive are vast and contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture. We actually have a bunch of classes that just started where you can learn Yiddish. We'll put a link in the chat to that, including exhibitions and public programs just like this one, where we bridge to aim the world of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. So today we have Michael Gawenda and Andrew Silow-Carroll joining us. Michael Gawenda is one of Australia's best-known journalists and authors. In a career spanning 4 decades, he was a political reporter, a foreign correspondent based in London and in Washington, a columnist, a feature writer, and a senior editor at Time magazine. He was editor and editor-in-chief of The Age from 1997 to 2004. Michael Gawenda has won numerous journalism awards, including 3 Walkie Awards. He was the inaugural director of the Center for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne, and he is the author of 4 books. And Andrew Silow-Carroll is New York Jewish Week's editor-at-large and managing editor for ideas of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Previously, he served as editor-in-chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, editor-in-chief and CEO of the New Jersey Jewish News, and wrote an award-winning weekly column in the Times of Israel. He was also the managing editor of the Forward magazine, editor of the Washington Jewish Week, senior editor of Moment magazine, and a reporter for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. So thank you all for joining us, and now I will hand it over to Michael and Andrew.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be doing this. Michael, it's a pleasure to meet you. Michael has written a book that is incredibly timely. I don't know if you could have known that when you probably finished it well before October 7th. But it has all the themes that have come to kind of fascinate and bedevil the Jewish community since then. But I want to start, Michael, if we can, it's called My Life as a Jew, so it's clearly biographical, autobiographical. And I think our YIVO audience will be especially interested in the first part of your life as a Jew, which is tell us a little bit about, and there's going to be a twist here that you're going to become maybe a different kind of Jew than you started out. But tell us what that was like, especially focusing on your time in Skiff, which I think you'll explain to the audience what it was and how you grew up in Australia.
Well, I was born in a DP camp after the war in Austria. My family migrated. My mum, dad, my 3 sisters migrated to Australia in 1949. I grew up in an organization called the Skiff. The Skiff was the youth organization of the Bund. The Bund had been a major Jewish organization in Eastern Europe. It was a socialist organization. It was an anti-Zionist organization. Its ideology was based on the belief that Jews are people of the world, and Jewish life ought to be fostered and supported wherever Jews live. At the center of their Jewishness was a commitment to Yiddish and Yiddish culture, and that's the environment I grew up in. I spoke Yiddish as my first language. My parents spoke to me only in Yiddish. I grew up speaking Yiddish. I went to a Yiddish Sunday school on Sunday mornings, and then to Skiff in the afternoon, where we learnt about the great leaders of the Bund, all of whom were Yiddish speakers, socialists. So that was the environment in which I grew up. We were, the Bund, the Skiv, us, we were a tiny section of the Jewish community in Australia, which was overwhelmingly Zionist, committed to Israel, and which in many ways treated people like me, the Bund, with some hostility. I've got to say, my sisters, my older sisters, I had sisters who were 20 and 19 and 17 years older than me, were Zionists. They had become Zionists in the DP camps in Austria. So they were not Bundists. And I can remember going to events with my older sister, Jewish events, where she warned me beforehand that I have to stand up when they play the Hatikva, that she is not going to accept me, because in the Bund in Skiv, we did not sing the Hatikva and we did not stand up for it. So that's the environment in which I grew up.
Mm-hmm. So how does that shape your young adult life? I mean, I think you refer to yourself as a secular, maybe cultural Jew. How do you carry that outside of
Well, I think I think I grew up a secular left-wing Jew. I always considered myself to be on the left. I was on the left. Because I was a journalist, I was never a member of a political party, and I never proclaimed my leftness. But I did work for a newspaper and then edit a newspaper, which was a left-of-centre newspaper. Its views its positions much like, for instance, the New York Times's positions on issues. Yeah, and I think that early on I was involved in Yiddish culture and Yiddish life. But in my early adulthood, after my parents had died, I think I no longer lived a really deeply Jewish life. I didn't speak Yiddish. I didn't go to Yiddish events in the main. I was not in any way part of the organized Jewish community. I saw myself, I don't think I even thought much in my 20s, much about Jewishness, what it meant to be a Jew. I felt little connection, as far as I can recall, overall to Israel, even though, memories play tricks with you. That's what I thought. And then someone reminded me that in 1967, on the eve of the Six-Day War, a number of us Bundists, Skifisten, went to the Zionist Centre here in Melbourne to register as volunteers to go to Israel. We never got a chance to go because the war was over, as you know, within a few days. But we must have been, I can't even remember how I felt, but obviously we felt like the Jews were under threat again. We were children of Holocaust survivors. We were never going to let this happen without our resistance to it. So there was a level at which being Jewish mattered to me. But in my day-to-day life, it didn't matter very much.
And as a journalist, did you get back to Israel to report on it? I think you did a number of times. What was your attitude when you came there to report on the situation? And you remind me of what era that would have been.
Well, the first time I went to Israel was in 1979 as a reporter. I mean, as a reporter, was in 1979. At that time, I was based in London for a correspondent in London for a group of Australian newspapers. They weren't Murdoch papers. I never worked for Rupert Murdoch, but I worked for a group of Australian newspapers. And I was close with the foreign editor of those newspapers, who at one stage suggested to me, he knew I had family in Israel, so he suggested, who I'd never seen, never spoken to, really, suggested to me that I go to Israel, do some reporting, write a series, and perhaps connect with my family. And that's what I did. Basically, I went to Israel. I spent, I can't remember, 3 weeks perhaps, met my family, wrote these articles. And that was the beginning of a kind of journey for me. Israel became real to me in a way that it had never been real before, a real place. And while even that first time, and even subsequently, it never felt like my home. It never felt like I never felt that this was my home in any real sense. That I was Australian, my home was in Australia. That's where my life was built. That's where I was involved in the public and private life of this country. But nevertheless, Israel felt special to me as a Jew. I connected on some level, which I never really explored at that time, that kind of surprised me. I felt a connection to the place that I hadn't felt before, because of my upbringing, I think, that I had never felt before.
You talk about the famous debate, and it might have been a little earlier, but around that time, a little earlier, between Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem about the whole idea of Ahavat Yisrael, which isn't love of Israel, but love of the Jewish people. And I wonder if, both when the Bundists volunteered to fight in Israel, and when you went there and had some of these discoveries, was that tapping something that, forget how you feel about Zionism, forget how you feel about the Israeli government, but just a sheer connection with the place where half of the world's Jews live. Was that part of it?
Absolutely. Yes, yes, that was a big part of it. And I want to say, I mean, I don't want to leave people with the suggestion that the Bund was not a thoroughly Jewish organization in Eastern Europe. The Bund believed in Jewish peoplehood. The Bund believed that the Jews were a people. What they didn't believe was that the Jews were a nation, and that the Jews needed a nation state of their own. But the idea that world Jewry was that Jews were connected. That was central to Bund ideology, and in fact, it was the basis on which, after the revolution in Russia, Bundists were persecuted. Bundists were, because they were considered social democrats and nationalists. Bundists were sent to the Gulag. The Bund was banned. Yes, but it awakened that going to Israel awakened this sense in me that of Jewish peoplehood, and asked of me this question: what does that mean to belong, to feel like you belong to the Jewish people? What does it mean in terms of the sort of Jew you are? That you belong to the Jewish people, does that mean that you are committed in some way to Jewish continuity? And if you are committed, and I did feel committed, I examined myself and I thought, I am committed. This is passed on to me from my parents. This is passed on to me even from the Bund, from the skiff where I grew up. The sense that we are committed to the continuity of Jewish life. At that point, I asked myself the question, because I had kids: how will I foster Jewish continuity? How will I make sure my kids at least have the possibility of being Jews, and of my grandchildren being Jews? How do I do that? And so that was sort of the beginning of this journey that I think I describe in my book.
You became editor of The Age, which is one of Australia's most important newspapers. I think it was 1997. You were the first Jewish editor, maybe the only one they've had. Did that feel like a milestone? And especially, I'm wondering if readers and rivals and your colleagues understood you were Jewish and they had certain expectations, either how you were going to cover Israel or, just good and bad. When that happened, was there, was that a
Well,
big deal?
for me personally, there was a sense that my mother and father would have been incredibly proud. My father was a great lover of newspapers, of literature, of writing, always encouraged me to write. He wanted me to be a schreiber. So he would have been not a doctor, not a lawyer, but a schreiber, which for him was sort of the highest calling. So I did feel at that time, I wish my parents were alive and had lived to see this happen. I didn't think of it in Jewish terms at that time, even though lots of other people did. I got from the time I was appointed, I got lots of messages from Jewish people saying, "What is this going to mean in terms of the paper's coverage of Israel? What's it going to mean? What sort of editor are you going to be? What sort of Jew are you?" Lots of those messages. But within journalism itself, within the paper, even though no one ever said this to me directly, I think there was concern about how the paper would now cover the Middle East, how I would direct the coverage of the Middle East in the future. I mean, you've got to remember that in 1997, there was still a sense that the Oslo Accords might work and that there may be the possibility of the process continuing, even though there were already suicide bombings and acts of terrorism at that time, and the right in Israel was totally opposed to the Oslo Accords. But there was some sense of optimism. So there was concern about how the paper would cover the Middle East, but there was not yet this consensus amongst journalists that Israel was an illegitimate state, which I think is true now amongst a lot of my former and current journalistic colleagues.
I want to talk about that's exactly what I want to talk about, how something changes. And again, you write about being a man of the left, but the left begins to kind of like move away from you. So talk about, some of the milestones in Australia at the time, which I think were happening all over the world. And when did you start to feel sort of an alienation that on this one topic, although you might have agreed on so many other things, that the left had just kind of moved away from where you were when it came to Israel?
Well, I think it was a process. Like I said back then in 97, I didn't think much about what it will mean for the coverage of the paper that I was editing, the fact that I was a Jew. Didn't mean much. There were staff members, I'm sure, that, like I said, were worried about it, but I wasn't particularly concerned about it. But I do think that by 2000, when the second Intifada started, and there was and on the paper and probably in other news organizations, there was great tumult about what was happening over there and how our paper was covering it. Now, I think that was true, particularly amongst journalists who worked for left liberal newspapers like The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, which was our sister paper, and in the ABC, which is the national broadcaster. And I found myself thinking that we are not on the same page, some of our journalists and me. I thought we were. I thought that they shared my values, my journalistic values. They shared my sense of what the conflict was about and how it should be covered. And what I mean by that is that we all accepted that this is about covering a conflict that was not about whether Israel should exist or not exist, but was about the way Israel treated the occupied people of Palestine and whether there was a way out of this that would result in a peace that involved a two-state solution. I thought that's the page we were all on, but we weren't. And the fact that there were journalists that came to me, spoke to me, friends, that I was surprised they weren't on the same page. And then I found that out there in the left in Australia, there were the beginnings of this move towards labeling Israel a colonial, apartheid, genocide, even genocidal state. That was happening already in the early 2000s, and in small sections of the left, not in huge, but in small sections of the left, that was happening amongst people I knew, including, I think, people who I had grown up with in the Bund, in Skiff. That was happening. So I think the realization that I was probably not the Jew I thought I was when I was growing up, that because of everything that was happening, Israel was more important to me than I thought it was. It had been. And in fact, I had greater feelings for it than I thought I had had. By then, I had been to Israel several times and I had made connections with my family. Very good friends, one in particular had made Aliyah to Israel. She was a painter who was sort of my mentor when I was growing up. I remained incredibly close with her. I visited her on many occasions. So my connections with Israel grew, and I don't know whether I call it love, my affection for the place grew. And my sense that Israel was central in some ways to the Jewish life, including for Jews of the diaspora, grew. And so within that framework, I realized that I was a particular Jew of the left that increasingly on the left would not be accepted. That's what happened. I mean, that's what happened over time. That's what happened. And my book is about that process of coming to terms with the fact that the leftist Jew, secular Jew, non-Zionist Jew that I had been was no longer the Jew I was. And I didn't really know what sort of Jew I was. But the book is kind of about that journey and towards the end of the book, there is a kind of discovery of where I was heading as a Jew. So Yes, and I think what happened was, I think my book was prophetic in some ways. All those trends on the left about Jews of the left who were not anti-Zionist exploded after October 7th. I think that many people on the left in the US, in Australia, who had considered themselves left-wing, small L liberal, Jews of the left, who were part of a left-wing movement. They had comrades across, non-Jewish comrades who they shared causes, they shared positions, they shared even positions on Israel and Palestine, suddenly realized that that wasn't true. They did not, there's fundamental things they did not share. And one of those things was that they believed you could be a liberal Zionist. You could believe in Israel's right to exist. You could despise the Netanyahu government. You could work for the creation of a true state for the Palestinians where they would have self-determination, but you could remain a leftist in good standing. That was no longer possible.
What accounts for that shift? What do you, I mean, this is, again, like you said, this is post-Oslo. Netanyahu or people like him have been in charge for, a generation. I mean, those are the standard explanations, but what do you think shifted on the left that said that liberal Zionism was no longer really a legitimate option? You either believed in a Palestinian state in all of Israel, or you believed Israel was illegitimate, but there was no real middle ground. What do you think accounted for that kind of shift on the left?
Well, I think that's quite a complicated question. I mean, I think one of the things that happened was that the ideology of the social justice ideology, the ideology of the position that the world could be divided between the oppressed and the oppressors, the idea that that being white inevitably meant that you were part of the oppressor class. The fact that Jews, and I'm not talking about Israel, the fact that Jews were considered white and privileged meant that Zionism and the belief in Jewish self-determination was actually a form of racism, really. And that Zionism, well, there was always a debate on the left about whether Zionism was a racist ideology. I mean, in 1975, the UN passed a resolution labeling Zionism racism, and that was supported by a lot of the left. So this was not a totally new thing, but it was incredibly, the idea was incredibly powerful for large sections of the left, and increasingly powerful in sections of the left, so that it became impossible for them, including friends, including people who were colleagues. And I'm sure there's lots of American Jews like me who have had this experience, where we were shocked. I was not as shocked as some people because I think I saw this coming, that really it was unable for us to continue our friendship, let alone a conversation about what was happening in Israel and Gaza, what was happening to Jews, whether anti-Semitism was real or unreal. I mean, there are people who were my friends and colleagues, including journalists, with whom I can't have those conversations now. Because there are certain basic things that we cannot agree on, that we see the world differently, even facts that we can't agree on. So I think I shouldn't exaggerate this. This isn't true for all people on the left. This is not true for all my colleagues in journalism. This is not true in the main for all the people in the Bund and in Skiff that I grew up with. It's not true. But it is true for a significant proportion of the left. And it is certainly true for the left that dominates the arts in this country. It is certainly true in universities in this country. I had a period of time where I worked at a university, where I set up at Melbourne University the Centre for Journalism, and actually developed a master's course that now is up and running. And I felt it back then. I felt back then that this university is captured. That in my faculty, in the arts faculty, in the School of Communications, it is basically captured by, I've got no other way of saying this, by woke ideology. And so I think that's been manifested, universities in America, universities in Australia. But for me, the main area of concern has been what has happened to journalism and what has happened in the arts, because my children are involved in the arts. My son and my daughter are part of a Jewish Yiddish group, and I write about this in the book too, the Besheva Singers, and they've been hugely successful. My son has got a band which has been successful, a non-Jewish band that's been going for 10 years, but I think they feel isolated. They feel like what they do, they feel unable to take part in a conversation online about issues that go to what it means to be Jew, what it means to support Israel, what it means to, they can't take part in those conversations because they will be attacked. And so I think that's true, not just in Australia, I think that's true in the US too. I speak to people in the US, I know that to be true too.
So I just want to remind our viewers that if you do have a question for Michael, please drop them into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and I will, get to them if I can. I want to ask just a little bit, just a quick primer on Australian politics. I'm talking about prime minister electoral politics. In the United States, we have two major parties. One is considered slightly more pro-Israel than the other, but in the main, Israel still has the support of Congress, which is both Democrat and Republican. In Australian politics, as some of the trends that you're talking about made its way into national elective politics, or is the country still officially, pro-Israel in a sense?
Well, I think officially we have two major parties, really. We have the Labor Party, which is, a social democratic party. In American terms, it would be, I think it would be more or less in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, perhaps a little more left than that. Then we have Then we have the Liberal Party, which is really a conservative party, and it is in coalition with a national party, which basically is also a conservative party that represents regional Australia. So they're the two main blocks. At the moment, the Labor Party is in government, and officially its position on Israel, which has been kind of bipartisan, has been that Israel has a right to exist. Israel is supported. Israel is in the DNA of both parties in terms of support for it. But in actual fact, the Labor government, the Labor Party, has moved away from that bipartisan position. I think that it has become much more, not anti-Israel, but much less supportive of Israel, and much more concerned about the fate of the Palestinians. To say the least, that's what they say. That's where they are. I think they have political issues that make it very difficult for them to express any sort of real support for Israel at this time, or to, for instance, call out what is clearly a real explosion of hostility to Jews on the left and within their own party in Australia. And I think the reason for that is a simple political reason. There are 120,000 Jews in Australia. There are now over 1 million Muslims in Australia. They have discovered their political power. They have a substantial percentage of the population of 5 or 6 seats in New South Wales and Sydney, and a similar number in Melbourne. They're all held by the Labor Party. They have the ability, people think they have the ability, Labor think they have the ability to change, to decide which party wins that seat, which parties win their seat, those seats. You got to know that there is a Green Party in Australia that has a number of seats, I don't know, half a dozen seats in the lower house but have control of the Senate in terms of they have the balance of power in the Senate.
Right.
And they are a straight out left-wing pro one Palestine party. They are squeezing the Labor Party, which feels that they're going to pick up seats from Labor in the inner city seats of Melbourne and Sydney, where there is strong support for the pro-Palestinian cause. So Jews, I think, like me, I've written a piece that will be published in a few weeks about this. I think the Labor Party has been terrible on its response to the rise in hostility to Jews. I think it's been mealy-mouthed about it. I think it's been unable to call out anti-Semitism in a forthright way. I think the Jewish community in Australia feels abandoned by this government. And to a certain extent, they've got good reason to feel that way.
Someone asked a question about, the BBC's admitting its own failures on coverage of the Middle East. I'm going to ask you, as a journalist of long-standing, maybe to give a report card on Australian journalism. What do they get right about the conflict, and what are they getting really wrong, in your opinion, over the last, maybe we can even talk about since October 7th?
Well, I think in the main, my major criticism of the Australian media's coverage of the conflict itself is that it's thin. They simply haven't got the resources to cover it properly. And so anyone that relies on the Australian media for the coverage will get a distorted picture of what is actually happening because they just haven't got the resources to cover it, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think there is a level at which Australian journalists, especially in the ABC, which does have some resources to cover the conflict, that they are, in the main, if not straight out, if not declared, they believe that journalism in this particular case does involve some level of prejudice for those that are powerless. They have to represent them more than the powerful, and that they believe, underlying everything, because they have said so publicly, they believe that there is a history to what is happening now that means that Israel is basically responsible for what is happening in Gaza, and not Hamas, not the Palestinians. They are the victims of Israeli aggression. I think that would be the view of most journalists covering the conflict. My major concern with journalism, I have written very little about the coverage, but I have written a lot about what seems to me to be a breakdown of what I thought journalism was always about, what the ethics of journalism was about. They were about fair, reporting accurately, not pushing agendas, being open about how you're coming to the stories that you're covering. Now, I think most journalists of my age and even older have worked on the basis of those ethics. I think there is now a generation of journalists that have rejected that. And I think that the big papers, the big papers have wrestled with this issue. The New York Times has wrestled with this issue. You know, the New York Times has wrestled with the issue of, can journalists, we have too, can journalists be activists and also cover the conflict that they're covering? Is that that they're being activists about? I mean, the New York Times, can I just say this? The New York Times had a journalist here in Australia that wrote stories about the Australian Jewish community and the Palestinian and Muslim communities. She became part of a WhatsApp group of Jewish creatives, writers, artists. She then downloaded the messages on that WhatsApp and passed those messages on to a activist for the Palestinian cause. She then passed those messages on to people who doxed those WhatsApp members. Now, is that not appalling? A journalist did that. A journalist for the New York Times. The New York Times response to that was, because the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about it, revealed this. Their response to that was, she behaved inappropriately. This was against our ethics, and she has been, I don't know what, disciplined, spoken to, something. And that was the end of the story. No apology to these people whose lives have been really deeply affected by what their journalists did. I wrote to them. Of course, they didn't respond. But the fact is, this is an example of how I reckon those people who run big media companies, big newspapers, have lost control of their papers. They are in the hands of their staff. They are concerned about how their staff is going to react to any editorial decisions they make. I think that's true at the Times and the Washington Post and it's true in the papers that that I grew up in Australia and that I once edited.
In your book, you talk about universalism and particularism, and that brings you right back to your Bund days, where there's this notion of Doigkeit, which is here-ness, right? As opposed to Jews need to be comfortable wherever they live and not just in a nation state. I've noticed, and I think other people have noticed over the years, that a younger generation of Jews in this country are kind of nostalgic for the Bundist Yiddish culture because it bypasses Israel. It reminds them that Jews are, have a universal, mostly liberal outlook, and that Israel is the antithesis. So I'm just curious, if do you talk to young Jews who kind of have that kind of nostalgia and really kind of want to go back to maybe the Judaism of your youth? And what would you say to them about, the idea of
I would say,
universalism?
I would say this. Yiddish, some of these young people, and they're not all young. The Bund in Australia, I know, is getting constant messages from people who want to know, could they set up a Bund in, I don't know, in New York, in New Zealand, in all over the place. Because of that, because they believe that the Bund represented and embodied a kind of Jewishness that was left-wing, rich in cultural terms, with a language that was kind of radical, a left-wing language. It was the language Isaac Bashevis Singer once said when he won the Nobel Prize. In his Nobel Prize speech, he said, Yiddish is the language of the powerless, right? And in a sense, that's true. Over the generations, it has been the language of the powerless. It's been the language of the diaspora, especially of the East European Jewish diaspora. So that is true. But to try to resurrect that particular language, that particular Jewishness, now, when Israel has been in existence for 80 years or whatever it is a pipe dream. It is the sort of Jewishness I grew up in was a Jewishness that predated Israel. The Jews were a people of the world. The center, in some ways, of Jewish life was in Eastern Europe, even more so than in the United States. That world has changed. Half the world of the Jews live in Israel. Israel has, whether we like it or not, whether some like it or not, changed Jewish life. And the Bashevis Singers, for instance, they would call themselves, if they had to, I mean, they don't like labels. They are supporters of Israel. They love Israel. Their music, their Yiddish music, which they are deeply steeped in, is not radical music. It is Yiddish folk music with which they started, songs from their childhood, but now it has gone into different places. It has examined Yiddish Kabbalistic poets. It has examined rabbinical writing. It has gone in Yiddish. When I was a child, my father was a Bundist, but my father spent Sunday afternoons with me and my older sister reading the Tanakh, the Bible, in Yiddish. He loved the Tanakh. So it is, and there were Zionists. People should know this. There were committed Zionists who were lovers of the Yiddish language, and there still are today. So I am not prepared I don't think it is Yiddish should not become the language of the anti-Zionists. It is not that. It can't be that. A language is not an ideology. That's not what it is. So people want to embrace Yiddish, embrace it in all its richness. You know who are the greatest Yiddish speakers now in the world? The Haredis. The Haredis. They are the Yiddish speakers.
The ultra-Orthodox, yeah.
And some of their writings about some of their lessons, the Rebbe wrote in Yiddish. Some of the great Zionists of the past, Ben Gurion and others, their first language was Yiddish. They spoke Yiddish. I mean, it is crazy to deny the broad Yiddish connection with Ashkenazi Judaism.
So, Michael, I have one more question for you, but first I want to urge people to read your book. It tells in more detail about when your parents left the DP camps, how they came to Australia, more about your career, more about some really interesting intellectual battles that you've engaged in, and some of your colleagues have. So I urge people to read your book. Since it was a journey from one kind of Jewish to another kind of Jewish, this is kind of a homey question, which is, where do you express yourself Jewishly right now in the most satisfying ways? I mean, it can't just be engaging with, anti-Zionists, but at some point, what gives you pleasure and comfort as a Jew?
Well, two things. Can I first say that it is a fantastic honor for me to appear here with you at YIVO. I can remember how my father spoke about YIVO and its importance. And this was before it had firmly established itself in New York, how he spoke about its role in the life of East European Jews like him when it was based in Lithuania, in Vilna. So for me, if I don't believe in an afterlife, but maybe there is one, and if my father is listening, Dad, this is for you. I am appearing at YIVO. So I want to say that. The second thing is that I love Yiddish music. I've reconnected in a way with Yiddish music through my kids and through other ways that I had lost connection with when I was younger. I did VCE, high school Yiddish. And I hadn't spoken Yiddish for years. That led me to, on some sort of path that I don't know how I got there, to writing Yiddish poetry, some of which has been published, so that I could quite rightly call myself a Yiddish poet. I am a Yiddish poet. Dad, if you're listening, watching, I'm a Yiddish poet. A
Schreiber, even.
A Schreiber. I am a Schreiber. So there's that. And the other thing that has happened, I must say, is that my book has had this profound impact on a lot of Jews in Australia. I've been flattered with emails and notes from people who have told me that it's deeply impacted their lives. They've been on similar journeys. At a time like this, my book has been a comfort and at the same time, I have spoken at events. They've slowed down a bit now. To really, literally, hundreds, if not thousands of people, Jews included, not just Jews, but non-Jews as well, about Jewish life, about what it means to be a Jew, what it should mean, what it means to me. And one of the things that, it's a good question you asked, because I believe that one of the responses that we must have to where we are is not allow us to be defined as Jews by those people who don't like us. But to define what it means to be a Jew for ourselves, and what that means for me is to be involved in Jewish life. And what does that mean? Be involved in Jewish culture, be involved in Jewish writing, maybe even, which I've done, go to a synagogue on the high holidays, sit where my mother once sat, and absorb whatever it is that I can absorb. So that's where I am. My children, in a way, are taking me on a Jewish journey. Their music is taking me on a Jewish journey. So that's where I am.
Perfect. I think that's a wonderful answer and a great note to end on. So the book is My Life as a Jew by Michael Gawenda. Thank you so much for being part of this. And Julia, I'll turn it back to you at YIVO for maybe your closing remarks. But thank you, Michael, and thank you for everyone for taking part. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.